they found her in a position no human body should take. Her limbs twisted backward, her hands curled like withered leaves, and her face locked in a silent scream that no soul could unhear. Lady Eleanor Bray, handmaid to Queen Elizabeth, had not simply died, she had been unmade. The bed linens she had just folded were untouched. The floor beneath her was cracked and blackened, scorched in a perfect ring. Her torso was fused to the bedpost, her flesh bubbled like wax, yet the rest of the chamber was pristine. No fire, no overturned candle, no spilled oil. Only the stench of sulfur and something else, something rotten, ancient, and wet. Her fellow handmaids swore she had cried out only once, but that single scream echoed for hours in their ears. Not a single doctor could explain how she burned from within as though her very blood had caught fire. The court said nothing. There was no public mourning, no funeral procession. Her name was erased from records within days, but everyone remembered. Because something like that doesn't vanish. It lingers. It haunts. And those who were there swore that the Queen herself refused to sleep in that room ever again. Elizabeth ruled with elegance, intelligence, and what the poets called divine light. But light casts shadows. And behind the velvet and silk of England's most celebrated court, the darkness crept like a disease. The Tudor crown was polished gold, but the hands that reached for it trembled with fear. The people called her Gloriana the Virgin Queen, but those who served her saw another side, one of bone charms, sealed doors, and unexplained deaths. Elizabeth had secrets, terrible ones, secrets that killed. Lady Eleanor's death marked the first public unraveling of those secrets. She had been no ordinary servant. Raised with noble blood, she had attended Elizabeth since the Queen's youth, one of the few who dared speak plainly to her. A woman of fierce loyalty and gentle hands, she was often seen adjusting Elizabeth's gowns, whispering comfort before royal appearances. Her presence calmed the Queen. Some said she was like a second mother. Others whispered that she was more protector, confidant, maybe even keeper of something forbidden. But then she died. Violently, horribly, and no one claimed the body. Whispers spread like plague through the palace. A servant said he saw Lady Eleanor days before her death, holding a small silver mirror, etched with strange runes, something never seen again after her death. Another swore she'd been spotted in the Queen's private chamber, touching a locked chest that only Elizabeth herself could open. A few claimed she had tried to leave the court and was stopped. None of them could be found to repeat their stories a week later. A rumor sprouted like mold that Lady Eleanor had discovered something, or perhaps uncovered something, that her death wasn't a punishment one, but a price, a blood offering, an exchange. Elizabeth's reaction was cold. Within 48 hours, she had her private quarters relocated. Nearly a third of her female attendants were dismissed or reassigned, many quietly vanishing without a trace. New staff were brought in from distant manors, people with no connection to court life, and Eleanor's name forbidden. The very mention of her drew icy stares and veiled threats. It was as though she had never existed, but for those still inside, the silence was louder than screams. Something changed in Elizabeth after that. At night, she reportedly refused to sleep alone. She ordered her mirrors covered all but one, which she kept hidden beneath velvet. It was said she often sat in silence before it, whispering in a language no one understood. Once a maid claimed to hear sobbing through the Queen's door, deep guttural weeping, the kind that sounds less human than animal. No one investigated. More deaths followed. A kitchen boy was found drowned in a dry basin. A young scribe gouged out his own eyes after being summoned to deliver a scroll to the Queen. A nobleman once favored by Elizabeth was found hanging from a tree in the palace gardens, his lips sewn shut with black thread. Again and again, those close to her fell one by one, their fates marked by violence, madness, or disappearance. And still Elizabeth remained untouched. Unaging, immovable. The physicians of the court learned men schooled in the classics had no answers. But the commoners whispered a word that would never be said in public curse. Some claimed Elizabeth had inherited more than just her mother's eyes. That Anne Boleyn, executed by her husband, had cursed the Tudor line with her final breath. That her daughter would rise to power, yes, but her throne would be built not on God's grace, but on blood and shadow. Others believed Elizabeth had made a bargain herself, that in exchange for a reign of power she had sacrificed something, or someone, and that the deaths were merely the bill coming due. Her fear of mirrors became legend. No one knew why. Some believed she saw something in them, a reflection that wasn't her own. Others said she once saw Lady Eleanor standing behind her, burned, but smiling. But perhaps most terrifying of all was this: Elizabeth didn't seem frightened. She seemed resigned. It was as if she knew, as if she had always known, that the crown she wore had teeth, and that every glory she enjoyed was carved from someone else's suffering. The handmaid who burned from within wasn't the last. She was only the beginning, the first victim of a slow, suffocating curse that wound itself tighter with every year of Elizabeth's reign. Not all queens are chosen by God. Some are chosen by things far older and far less merciful. She was beautiful once, blonde, delicate, quiet. The kind of woman whose presence dimmed next to her husband's rising star. Amy Robsart was the wife of Robert Dudley, Elizabeth's favorite, the man whispered to be the Queen's secret lover. Amy died on a staircase, her neck broken, alone. The house was silent that morning, her servants mysteriously scattered. No one heard her fall. No one saw her climb the stairs, and when they found her at the bottom, twisted her skull-fractured eyes wide open in terror, it looked too clean. Too perfect. An accident they ruled, but no one believed it. Amy's death remains one of the most enduring scandals of Elizabeth's reign. She died in 1560, just 2 years after Elizabeth took the throne. Robert Dudley was already rising, handsome, ambitious, intimate with the Queen, in ways no other man dared to be. But he was married. Amy was an obstacle. And then, as if conjured by fate or something darker, she was gone. But the details don't sit right. Amy was known to be ill in the months before her death, but not mortally. Some said she suffered from a malady of the breast, perhaps cancer. Others claimed she had grown deeply depressed, withdrawn. Some letters from her final days suggest she feared for her life. She wrote to her household staff with strange instructions to attend church, to leave her alone for certain hours. And then suddenly she insisted all of them attend a local fair the morning of her death, leaving her completely unattended in the house. No guards, no witnesses. Just Amy and whatever followed her down the stairs. The fall broke her neck, but the coroner noted something odd. There were no signs of a struggle, no bruises suggesting she tried to save herself. She didn't catch herself on the banister. She didn't reach out. It was as if she didn't fall, but was pushed by something invisible, something unstoppable. The gossip was immediate. He had her killed, they said, speaking of Dudley, so he could marry the Queen. The court hissed with speculation, the people outraged. But Elizabeth did not punish him. She distanced herself, yes, publicly, but privately their connection only deepened. What if Amy's death wasn't just a crime of passion or ambition? What if it was a ritual? Some historians quietly have raised the possibility that Amy's death bears marks of something more archaic. The deliberate isolation, the precise timing on a holy day, no less. The location a stairwell, a traditional site for crossroads and old pagan rites. The sacrifice of a wife to elevate a man. And the ultimate reward, that man's increased intimacy with the Queen herself. There are records buried in private letters and half-burned reports suggesting Elizabeth did not attend Amy's funeral. She sent no message, no wreath, no token of grief, and yet weeks later she was seen wearing a new piece of jewelry, a ring inscribed with a Latin phrase translated loosely as "Through death we rise." Its origin remains unknown. Robert Dudley's behavior after Amy's death only stoked the flames. He petitioned the Queen relentlessly for marriage. He was turned down publicly, but he never left her side. Elizabeth kept him close for decades, showered him with titles, influence, and lands. When he died, it was with a letter from her at his bedside addressed simply, "My eyes." But others around them did not fare so well. Those who investigated Amy's death privately quietly met strange ends. One lawyer who called for a reopened inquiry died of sudden fever within the week. A servant who had spoken out about the state of Amy's body was found drowned in a horse trough. And the physician who first examined her remains disappeared en route to London and was never heard from again. A pattern emerges. Those who got too close to the truth were silenced not just politically but permanently. As for Amy's spirit, the legends say she never left. Her ghost is said to haunt Cumnor Place, the estate where she died. Visitors have reported seeing a pale figure at the staircase weeping, staring toward the upper floor where no room remains. Dogs refuse to enter. Candles refuse to stay lit. And on some nights the wind in the hall carries a voice. It wasn't me. Elizabeth never spoke Amy's name in public. She never answered questions about her. But those close to her knew something had changed after Amy's death. The Queen's nights grew restless. She began wearing darker colors. She insisted on being surrounded by guards at all hours. And she grew increasingly attached to astrologers, those who claimed to read signs from beyond. There is one account written in the diary of a palace maid of Elizabeth collapsing during a private supper. When revived, she screamed that a woman with a broken neck had been standing behind her hands, outstretched mouth open. The Queen demanded the mirrors be covered and refused to eat for 3 days. Was Amy haunting her? Or was it something else, a force that demanded blood and never stopped? The death of Amy Robsart was the first crack in the moral armor of Elizabeth's reign. Not just a tragedy, but a sacrifice. Whether by Dudley's ambition, the Queen's silent consent, or something darker that moved through them both, Amy fell so that something else might rise. They buried her quietly. But the whispers never died, and neither did the sense that Elizabeth from that day forward was never truly alone. It came like a shadow. No warnings, no visible entry, just sudden death. The court was in high spirits in the summer of 1563. The Queen held court at Windsor, feasting with nobles, attending dances, inspecting armies. But then, without ceremony, the coughing began. One page fell, then another. Bleeding from the nose, fevered shaking. The sweating sickness, they called it. But this wasn't like the other plagues England had known. It moved faster, killed quicker, and most chilling of all, it struck only the Queen's household. In the span of just 3 weeks, 38 members of her inner court were dead. Her personal groom collapsed while brushing her horse. Her favorite lute player was found stiff in the corner of the music room, face gray eyes wide open. A servant girl drowned in her own blood in the Queen's laundry chamber. Elizabeth was untouched. Entire cities were spared, but her court decimated. The doctors blamed foul air. The priests blamed sin. But the servants whispered about something older than either. Something invited. Something now feeding. Elizabeth fled the palace. She rode day and night to Nonsuch, locking herself in a private chamber and refusing to see anyone but 2 trusted advisors. Even her food was prepared by alchemists, not cooks. She burned herbs, sage, rosemary, sulfur nightly. She refused to sleep unless the windows were sealed with wax. When her physicians begged her to allow an exorcist, she only replied, "What good is prayer against what I command?" The meaning of those words still chills. Why did Elizabeth survive? She moved freely among the infected. She held their hands. She shared their air. And yet she never showed a single symptom. Not once. One maid, terrified, kept a diary in secret. She wrote, "The Queen stood at her mirror and asked aloud, 'Must they all go, will that satisfy you?' She waited. Then she laughed, cold and sharp. Then we were ordered to burn the bodies." Another wrote of strange marks found in the Queen's bedchamber. Circles drawn in ash behind the curtains. Animal bones hung behind the door. A small cloth doll with pins in its chest hidden beneath her mattress. When a priest dared ask about it, he was sent away that same evening. He was found 3 days later in a field outside London, his tongue missing, throat filled with dirt. The epidemic did not spread to the general population. Physicians expected devastation. London braced for the worst. But the plague stopped, almost as quickly as it began. It touched no neighboring palaces, no nearby manors, no townsfolk. It began and ended with Elizabeth's court, as though whatever force had entered had only one target and had been satisfied with its harvest. Elizabeth returned to court weeks later with a new glow, almost unnatural. She smiled more. Her appetite returned. She wore gold and crimson again, but those who had seen her during the height of the sickness said her eyes had changed. She no longer blinked like we do, one surviving page wrote. She stared too long, as if listening to something behind your words. The Queen commissioned a new private chapel shortly after the plague. No clergy were assigned. No public services were held. It was sealed to everyone but her. Servants claimed to hear chanting late at night, but the words weren't Latin. One reported a smell of burning hair and wet stone, a stench no fire could explain. Years later, a courtier who served during that period claimed Elizabeth believed the deaths were necessary. She told me, he wrote, "I was meant to rise, and for some to rise, others must drown." He left England that same year and never returned. This wasn't the only time the court would experience death in a concentrated burst. In 1578, another fever swept the Queen's musicians and entertainers. 22 performers dead in a fortnight. Again, no sign of Elizabeth's illness. Again, no outside spread. Patterns began to emerge every time the Queen seemed on the brink of emotional collapse or political threat. The deaths would return. Not among enemies. Among those closest to her? Lovers? Servants? Protectors? The physician John Bennet, who tended to many of the plague victims, began collecting notes. He wrote of the Queen's immunity, suspecting a tainted essence within her blood. His notes were seized. He vanished in 1581. The idea of a monarch being cursed is not new, but with Elizabeth, it was never clear if she was the curse. How else can we explain it? Death that moved surgically through the royal household, sparing no one except her. Diseases that obeyed walls, paused for silence, and killed without spreading. Rooms that became tombs overnight. The Queen continued to surround herself with men of strange knowledge. John Dee, her astrologer and advisor, spent long nights at her side, mapping stars, decoding hidden texts, speaking of portals within the self. He claimed he had found a language older than any known to man. Elizabeth listened. She believed. She called him my philosopher, though others whispered my sorcerer. The Queen's immunity from plague became a legend, but legends carry weight, and weight often buries those beneath it. The bodies were burned, the records erased, but those who were there never forgot the look in her eyes when another servant collapsed. She didn't mourn, she didn't panic. She only whispered one word. Again. It was supposed to be a simple thing, a clean end to a long threat. But when the axe fell, the Queen's nightmares began. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots' cousin and rival to Elizabeth, I was more than just a political inconvenience. She was a symbol. A Catholic figurehead, a claimant to the English throne, and a living rebuke to Elizabeth's so-called virgin purity. Mary was everything Elizabeth was not: passionate, scandalous, maternal. She had married loved-born children. She was wild and dangerous. But most of all, she was cursed. By the time Mary arrived at Fotheringhay Castle, she had been imprisoned for 19 years. Letters had been intercepted, proof the court said of her involvement in plots to assassinate Elizabeth. Parliament called for her death. Advisors begged the Queen to sign the warrant, and she did. But the ink barely dried before something changed in Elizabeth. She began waking in cold sweats. Her appetite vanished. She whispered to her reflection, asking questions with no answers. When the day of execution came, Elizabeth was nowhere near. She had fled the court. Some say she tried to revoke the order. Others say she wept. But the execution went forward. What happened next would haunt England forever. Mary was led into the execution chamber wearing scarlet, a martyr's color. Her final words were not for Elizabeth, but for God into thy hands. O Lord, I commend my spirit. She knelt, The first axe blow missed her neck and struck the back of her head. The second partially severed her throat. The third finished it, but when the executioner lifted her head to show the crowd, something grotesque occurred. Her wig came off. The head fell, revealing gray, thinning hair. Gasps filled the hall. Then suddenly her lips moved. Not just a twitch, a full, visible movement. 3 times witnesses swore. As if she was trying to speak, the executioner panicked. Blood poured from the neck like wine. Her dog, hidden beneath her skirts, emerged wailing and drenched in her blood. The body would not stop bleeding. Servants scrubbed the floor for hours. It wouldn't come clean. Back in London, Elizabeth entered a state of visible collapse. She raged at her counsel. She denied having signed the warrant. She cried out in her sleep. She refused to say Mary's name. When shown a miniature portrait of her cousin, she recoiled, claiming the eyes were moving. For weeks she would not sit in rooms with red decor, but the worst came for those who carried out the deed. Sir Amias Paulet, Mary's jailer, died of wasting fever 2 months later. His wife found him screaming about a white figure in chains. The executioner himself, Richard Bull, was found dead in his home, his face frozen in horror with every mirror in the house shattered. His apprentice who had held Mary's skirts went blind within days. It wasn't just superstition. Something was wrong. The Archbishop of Canterbury, present at the execution, wrote privately of a foul presence in the room. I felt it wrap around my throat, he penned, as though the act itself released something that had been chained too long. The scroll was sealed, never published. Found only centuries later in a locked drawer marked, "Never to be opened." Elizabeth changed after that. She no longer allowed herself to be left alone, not even for a moment. She walked the palace halls at night. She began muttering under her breath. Her hair, already thinning, fell out in clumps. Her skin grayed. She insisted on sleeping with a candle burning until dawn. But perhaps most disturbing was the obsession. She had Mary's blood-stained dress brought to the palace secretly. She kept it locked in a trunk near her private writing desk. No one knew why. Some said she visited it at night. Others said she spoke to it. A guard claimed he once saw her open the chest and laugh, a deep, unnatural laugh he described as belonging to no woman. From that point forward, Elizabeth's decisions grew erratic. She became paranoid. Ministers were dismissed without explanation. Old allies were imprisoned, and always the red returned subtle at first. A ribbon, a shawl, then gowns, curtains, carpets. As though she were becoming Mary, or being haunted by her. The death of Mary, Queen of Scots, was a political act, yes, but it was also a spiritual rupture. A soul torn from a body by a woman who would never know rest again. The 2 queens, one living, one dead, became bound in legend. One lost her head, the other lost her peace. They say that after Mary's execution, Elizabeth was often heard whispering in French, "Pardonnez-moi," forgive me. But whether it was meant for Mary or for herself, no one knows. One final note remains. On the first anniversary of Mary's death, a fire broke out in the Queen's chambers. The cause was never found. No flame touched the walls, but a single object was burned to ash, a small wooden cross Elizabeth had kept since childhood. From that day forward, she never entered a church without trembling. He called them angels, but the things he summoned left claw marks on the walls. Dr. John Dee was not a man of superstition. Mathematician, astronomer, navigator, philosopher. But behind the curtain of science, he was also Elizabeth's closest conjurer, a man obsessed with the secrets of the beyond. He believed that knowledge came from higher beings, that language itself could be a divine key. He searched for what he called the Enochian tongue, a primordial language of angels lost to mankind, capable of unlocking the gates between worlds. And Elizabeth let him. No, she encouraged him. They met often secretly, in chambers cleared of staff under moonlight and silence broken only by Dee's chanting and the Queen's breath. Witnesses claimed she trusted no one more, not even Dudley. She called Dee her Merlin. Some say he taught her how to bind pain to seal nightmares into objects. Others say he taught her how to speak to the dead, but the rituals, they left behind scars. In 1581, Dee and his medium Edward Kelly claimed to have made contact. Not with angels, not exactly. Dee insisted they were beings of higher intelligence, but the descriptions his assistant left behind tell another story. Beings with wings of flame, eyes like black pits, voices that bled from glass and turned milk sour. Kelly begged to stop. Dee refused. "They are divine," he wrote, "but they test us." Elizabeth summoned Dee more frequently after that. Nights grew longer. Her chamber walls were covered in tapestries to hide what servants later described as burn marks. Scorched rings, claw patterns, strange symbols in soot. Dee brought her a polished obsidian mirror, jet black cold to the touch. He claimed it allowed her to speak to those beyond time. She kept it near her bedside. That mirror remains in a museum today. Visitors say they feel watched. Some report nausea. One guard quit after seeing a woman's face reflected over his own. In 1583, Dee performed a final ritual at the Queen's request. He claimed the veil had grown thin that they could look through it just once. The ritual required a sacrifice? No one knows what was given, but days later one of Elizabeth's beloved hounds was found skinned alive in her garden. Its blood had been used to draw a circle beneath the floorboards of her private chapel. That chapel was permanently sealed that same week. After that ritual, Dee began to deteriorate. He lost weight. He stopped sleeping. He wrote in fragments, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in the Enochian tongue. He reported voices whispering in his homestones that bled when touched, and a shadow that stood behind him, even when he turned. He begged Elizabeth for release. She refused. "You have gone too far," she told him. "You cannot come back with your hands empty." Edward Kelly fled England. He wrote a final letter to Dee in which he claimed they had opened a thing that will never close. Dee died in poverty, forgotten, raving about a mirror that eats. But the Queen kept his mirror. Always. Her behavior became stranger. She spoke to reflections that weren't there. She stared at corners as if something lived in them. One maid dismissed for disobedience later wrote that Elizabeth insisted her shadow had begun moving on its own. Other courtiers began to fear the Queen. Ambassadors from Spain and France reported chills in her presence, a scent of ozone and burning sugar that clung to her clothing. Children refused to look her in the eyes. A boy once screamed at the sight of her, claiming her face was wrong, though none saw anything amiss. The boy died of fever that night. Elizabeth never blamed Dee. She continued to defend him even as his reputation soured. He served a purpose, she said once, but could not bear the gift he carried. When asked what that gift was, she only smiled and said, "He helped me see what must be seen." After Dee's death, the mirror disappeared for a time, but it was recovered among the Queen's personal effects after her own death, wrapped in black cloth buried beneath 6 layers of silk, alongside several handwritten notes. One of them in Elizabeth's unmistakable hand reads, "Do not gaze." It remembers. The implications of Dee's work with Elizabeth are terrifying. If the Queen did make contact with something, did she understand what it truly was? Or did she only believe she could control it? It's possible Elizabeth believed these powers protected her, that the inexplicable deaths, her immunity to plague, her uncanny hold over others were not coincidences but rewards. Proof that the gate Dee opened was meant for her alone. But power like that has consequences. Elizabeth began aging rapidly in the decade following Dee's last ritual. Her skin peeled in thin sheets. Her nails yellowed. She wore thicker layers of makeup, but it couldn't hide the truth. Her body decayed, but she would not die. She refused all doctors, refused all medicine. One servant claimed to have found dozens of dead moths in her bed, their wings blackened. She was being kept alive, but not by nature. They say John Dee brought knowledge into the Queen's hands. But perhaps what he brought was a curse. A doorway not into heaven, but into something far, far worse. And Elizabeth never shut it. She stopped sleeping toward the end. Servants said the Queen paced for hours at night back and forth, the heavy echo of her slippers ticking like a death clock down the halls. She mumbled, muttered, gasped. Once a guard reported hearing her scream only once, but so violently that birds scattered from the palace rooftops. No one was allowed to enter her chamber unless summoned, and when they were, they left changed. Elizabeth's eye was no longer the radiant Gloriana. She was hollowed. Her face beneath the layers of lead and eggshell makeup was gaunt and bruised. Her lips bled. Her gums blackened. Her hair had fallen away completely. But worse was her eyes vacant, unfocused, yet constantly darting to corners of the room, watching shadows, avoiding mirrors. She forbade the presence of glass. Not a single reflective surface was permitted in her bedchamber in her final months. She claimed they lied that the reflections showed things that were not real, or worse, showed things that were real but no longer human. She whispered once to a chambermaid that the woman in the mirror has begun moving on her own. By the early 1600s, Elizabeth's behavior had become erratic, even for those used to her rituals. She refused to lie down, believing that sleep would invite something inside her. For 3 straight days, she stood motionless, eyes wide, murmuring under her breath in a strange cadence. Doctors begged her to rest. She refused. "If I close my eyes, I will not be the one who wakes," she said. She knew something was coming. It began with the smell. Her chamber reeked of decay, flesh mildew, burnt sugar, and wet stone. Multiple courtiers wrote of a stench they could not explain. A death smell that clung to the walls, soaked into the drapes, and turned food to rot in hours. They burned sage and lavender, but the odor always returned. Then came the sounds. At night, guards posted outside her door claimed to hear whispers, not speech whispers like breath pressed against flesh. Sometimes laughter, sometimes sobbing. Once on a night when no one dared move, a deep voice uttered a single word. "Ready." Inside, Elizabeth refused all contact. She wrote cryptic notes. One read, "It cannot take what I do not give." Another, "He waits in the walls. I feel him when I breathe." When her counselors attempted to enter by force, she struck one with a candlestick and screamed that none but the dead may cross the threshold. Eventually, the door was left untouched. Then silence. She was found in her chair, sitting upright, her body stiff, her skin translucent and stretched tight. Her eyes had sunken deep into the skull, and the expression on her face wasn't peaceful. It was terror. Utter frozen terror. Her lips were parted, teeth bared as if caught in the middle of a final scream. The attending physician vomited when he saw her. Her fingernails were shattered, her hands torn as though she'd been clawing at the arms of the chair. Her neck bore bruises in the shape of long fingers, far too long to be human. And around her throat was something no one could explain, a faint imprint, like a collar or rope, but without a single strand of cloth or fiber. Just a mark. And her tongue missing. The cause of death was never officially recorded. No autopsy was performed. The body was wrapped immediately in layers of linen and herbs and sealed in a lead coffin. The official report described a peaceful passing, but those who were there never used that word again. Rumors swirled immediately. One maid claimed the queen had been speaking to something that lived in the floor. Another swore she had been making deals, writing letters in blood, burning them beneath the floorboards. A guard confessed on his deathbed that he had seen Elizabeth floating just inches off the floor while her skin split open in silent patterns across her back. No one believed him. No one wanted to believe him. After her death, her bedchamber was locked. It remained sealed for over a year. When it was finally opened, nothing inside had decayed. Everything was as she left it, except the walls. Blackened, as though touched by smoke or ash. The floor was warm to the touch, and in the center of the ceiling, directly above the chair where she died, was a perfect circle scorched into the plaster. They painted over it. Still, it bled through. And then there was her burial. Elizabeth was interred in Westminster Abbey beside her sister Mary Tudor. The ceremony was rushed, quiet, strange, no viewing, no public mourning period. During the transfer of her coffin, 3 men in the procession collapsed. One began seizing, another went blind in one eye. One clergyman refused to enter the abbey at all, claiming that the queen's coffin sang. The embalmer was never named. His records vanished. The truth buried. But one final account remains, kept hidden for centuries, discovered only in the private diary of a nun who had once tended to the royal court. She wrote that before Elizabeth died, She confessed something to a mirror, something not meant for ears, only reflection. "I was never alone," the queen had said. "He's been with me since the fire." No one ever found out what fire, but maybe it wasn't a what. Maybe it was a who. The closer you got to Elizabeth, the more violently you died. It became a quiet truth in court, never spoken aloud, but deeply understood. Proximity to the queen was perilous. Those who served her most loyally, those who loved her, protected her, worshipped her, rarely lived long or well. They perished in ways too specific, too brutal and too synchronized to be fate. It was as though the throne itself demanded a toll in blood. Take Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. Young, dashing, ambitious. He captivated Elizabeth, in her later years became her favorite, even dared to call her by pet names. But when he crossed her, when he disobeyed a single command, raised troops without her permission, he was arrested. His execution was swift but strange. On the scaffold, the first stroke of the axe missed. The second hacked into muscle. The third finally struck bone. Witnesses fainted. Blood soaked the stage. His head, once severed, is said to have grinned. Before his death, he sent a final message to Elizabeth. "Your shadow will outlive us all." She never responded. Then there was the Boleyn curse. Anne Boleyn's family, the Queen's maternal line, suffered cruel fates after Elizabeth rose. A cousin burned alive for suspected treason. A niece who was thrown from a window in Calais. Another relative who drowned in his own fountain, though he was a strong swimmer, and the water barely chest-high. The Boleyn name became a whisper. A warning. Even the Queen's ladies-in-waiting fared no better. Lady Catherine Knollys, a trusted companion, died of sweating sickness, but her body blackened before death. Her servants refused to touch the corpse. Another Lady Helena Radcliffe began having visions of a burning man with no face, and threw herself from the tower steps, her head dashed open on the stones. The only thing she left behind was a single word carved in her desk. Debt. The men who dared to love the Queen suffered worst of all. Thomas Seymour, her stepfather and rumored suitor in her youth, was executed for treason after being caught entering the young Elizabeth's chamber at night. But the guards swore he was unarmed, confused, murmuring nonsense about a promise under the stairs. His body was later found to bear bruises that could not be explained by the scaffold alone, long scratches, deep punctures, as though something had clawed him from within before the axe ever fell. William Cecil, her closest advisor, began hearing voices in his final months. He would mutter names no one recognized, scribble diagrams of gates and flames in the margins of government ledgers. His last written note reads, "I have seen it. The fire does not burn, it feeds." He died raving, his eyes rolled back into his skull. The noble houses that aligned too closely with Elizabeth Berkeley. Howard Grey each suffered losses. Daughters miscarried, sons drowned, entire family lines extinguished by accident, illness, or suicide. Patterns emerged. Every family elevated by Elizabeth eventually paid a price. Often in flesh, often in madness, and through it all she remained untouched. There was a belief growing among the lower servants that Elizabeth had made a pact not just with power, not just with magic, but with something ancient. That her throne was not carved by politics or divine right, but by sacrifice. That every death was a payment, a deal to keep her alive, sovereign and untouchable. One midwife, anonymous in court records, claimed the Queen once demanded she destroy a stillborn thing delivered in the dead of night, not from Elizabeth herself, but from a woman cloaked in royal fabric. The creature, she said, had eyes that never blinked, and a mouth full of teeth despite being no larger than a loaf of bread. She was ordered to burn it. She swore she heard it scream as it turned to ash. This story was dismissed as hysteria. The midwife was sent to a convent. She hung herself the following week. Then there were the portraits. In Elizabeth's later years, commissioned paintings were heavily edited. Her face was smoothed, her body draped in ever more elaborate cloth. But in the originals, several of which were mysteriously destroyed, artists claimed they saw things in her eyes. Not reflections, movements, not human. One painter, Isaac Oliver, gouged out his own eyes shortly after completing a miniature for the Queen. In his final moments, he carved into his studio floor, "She wears a crown of bone." The Virgin Queen left no heir, no husband, no legitimate offspring. Yet her line cursed the ones who came close, as if proximity to her bloodline itself drew misfortune. Even James VI of Scotland, her appointed successor, reportedly kept his coronation crown, locked in a silver chest for a month, refusing to wear it. "It stinks of her," he allegedly said. Elizabeth's death should have marked an end to the suffering, but it didn't. Strange deaths continued in the palace. Rooms she once occupied were closed permanently. Her personal effects, books, letters, rings, were buried in sealed boxes. Some were burned. Some, it said, were locked away in the tower, never to be opened. And yet even then her curse lingered. The air in her chambers stayed cold. Servants refused to enter. Several claimed to see her, just the back of her head, sitting at her old vanity brushing hair that wasn't there. When approached, the figure vanished. Those who touched her belongings often suffered night terrors. One archivist collapsed while cataloging her personal prayer book. He awoke screaming, "She won't let go. No one gets close to the Queen and leaves whole." Because to love her, to serve her, was to be part of something ancient, cruel, and bound in silence. She was not a monarch. She was a monument, one built from bone and grief and blood. And the deeper we dig into her legacy, the more we realize the golden age was not gold at all. It was rust. The last thing Elizabeth I left behind was a box. No one knows exactly what was inside it, only that it was locked, wrapped in black velvet, and placed in her private quarters the night before her death. It bore no royal seal, no inscription, only a single symbol scorched into the lid, a circle within a triangle surrounded by 11 dots. The symbol does not appear in any Tudor archives, but scholars later found a near match in an occult manuscript from the 13th century. Its meaning to bind what should not speak. The box was never opened. It vanished after her death. Some say it was buried beneath Westminster. Others claim it lies in the Tower of London, hidden in a wall behind a sealed door. A few believe it was thrown into the Thames on the orders of King James after too many guards assigned to watch it began losing their minds. But the curse did not go with it. In the centuries since Elizabeth's death, strange things have continued to happen in the places she once ruled. Windsor, Richmond, Hampton Court. Each of these royal homes has reported unexplainable phenomena. Fires that leave no burn marks. Footsteps in locked rooms. Mirrors that crack from within. A figure in white, sometimes faceless, sometimes weeping, always seen just at the edge of vision. And those who've dared to disturb her memory have paid dearly. In 1867, an antiquarian attempted to unseal a hidden chamber at Richmond Palace, said to house personal articles of Her Majesty. He died of an aneurysm days later after scrawling in his own blood, "The silence is a mouth." During World War II, a bomb was dropped on Westminster Abbey. It destroyed the surrounding tombs, but not Elizabeth's. Her coffin remained untouched. Survivors said it was as if the explosion had skipped over it. In 1974, a historian attempting to replicate John Dee's angelic rituals in the Queen's Old Chapel was found catatonic, eyes rolled back, mouth filled with ash. He had written only one word in his notebook, "her." And the mirror, the black obsidian mirror gifted by Dee, still exists. It resides in the British Museum. It's labeled as John Dee's speculum. But curators have quietly admitted that its location changes. Sometimes it's found covered in condensation, though the room is climate-controlled. Sometimes it reflects things that aren't there. Flickers faces, light sources that don't exist. At least one visitor claimed to see the Queen herself whispering, "No one works the night shift near the mirror anymore." Perhaps the most chilling thing of all is this: Elizabeth was never exorcised. Most monarchs receive blessings, final rites, sacred rituals. Not her. No priest ever closed her story. Her spirit, if such a thing persists, was left unbound. And if she did make a bargain, if she did feed something unspeakable during her reign in exchange for power, purity, and near immortality, then it may still be with us. Still hungry. Still waiting. Because Elizabeth's legacy is not just one of art, empire, and diplomacy. It's a haunting. A crown that pierced flesh and left blood on every page of English history. The Virgin Queen may have died alone, but she left behind something that still breathes in the walls of palaces, still watches in mirrors, and still whispers through time. They called her Gloriana, but the real name, the name no one dares speak, may be something much older, much darker. And if you ever feel something cold pass behind you in a silent hallway, don't turn around. She doesn't like to be seen. If this tale chilled you to the bone, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and ring the bell for more stories pulled from the darkest corners of history. What do you think Elizabeth saw in her final days? Do you believe she made a deal with something not of this world? Drop your thoughts or your theories below. Thanks for watching. Sleep with the lights on tonight. We'll see you in the shadows.